This is Kofi Time.
People have a right to decide who governs them, how they are governed, and by whom.
20 years ago, Kofi Annan was awarded, together with the United Nations, the Nobel Peace Prize. Regarded as one of the modern world's icons of diplomacy, what's his legacy today? How can we prepare for tomorrow based on his vision for a better world? Hello, I'm Ahmad Fawzi, and I had the pleasure and privilege of working with Kofi Annan, accompanying him on many missions around the world as one of his spokespersons and communication advisor. Today we will discuss the state of democracy in Africa. Kofi Annan was passionate about democracy, about the value of democracy as a catalyst for better governance, for greater security, and for human development. In fact, a few months before he passed away, he said, and I quote, "The spread of democracy has been one of the most profound and positive developments that I have witnessed over my career." End quote. Today, however, democracy is in retreat on all continents. Military coups are making a comeback in countries like Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali, and leaders hold on to power well into their old age, sometimes in violation of their country's constitutions. Why has trust in democracy eroded on the continent? And are people really willing once again to put their fate in the hands of strong men? What are the consequences of this slide towards autocracy, and how can it be reversed? Are there good democratic practices in Africa that can be applied elsewhere? To answer these questions and more, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Mohamed Ibn Chambas, a Ghanaian lawyer, a politician, a diplomat, an academic, someone who knew Kofi Annan very well, and who himself has spent decades promoting good governance, democracy, and peace in Africa, and in particular, in West Africa. Dr. Mohamed Ibn Chambas, welcome to Kofi Time.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. It's my pleasure.
Let me first ask you about your personal interaction with Kofi Annan. You worked closely with him. You knew him well. What impressed you most about his approach to the enormous challenges he faced during his tenure? Was there a particular trait or traits in his personality that struck you most?
Distinguishing features or characteristics of Kofi Annan was his calmness, his gentility. It was infectious. And even in the heat of the storm, no matter how tense situation was, no matter how deep the crisis, if you were around Kofi and trying to navigate and find solutions, you always found him to be calm under pressure, but he was also always optimistic and hopeful. And I guess when you have to deal with some of these challenges, which can be frankly frustrating, depressing, being a leader and having that sense of hopefulness can help to carry others along so that despair doesn't take over. He always showed a deep understanding of this complex crisis, which indicated that he read his briefs. Of course, he was a workaholic, and he did not take anything for granted. He had deep and great respect for others. He listened. He was the listening type. I've dealt with many very high-profile leaders who, when you begin to give your perspective, you feel that they're not listening. They have already decided what the solutions are. That was not Kofi. Kofi would give everyone an opportunity to express themselves and to bring their own perspectives. And this is what gives a leader such as Kofi the kind of depth that he came to with on any of the issues that he was dealing with. But he was also a very considerate person. He had compassion. I've explained it as maybe part of that Ghanaian upbringing where, in a community, everybody is their brother and sister's keeper. And we have to work together to enhance everybody's well-being. But also career-wise, maybe him starting from a humanitarian side and moving on to political development, etc., laid that foundation of empathy for those who are affected in conflict and the most vulnerable.
A lot of our guests have spoken about Kofi Annan's calmness and his respect for others, and above all, what you said towards the end, his ability to listen. So he was a listener, compassionate, considerate, and as you said. Dr. Ibn Chambas, Mohamed, if I may, you've had an illustrious international career. You're currently a member of the board of the Stockholm Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. From 2014 and for 7 years to 2021, you served as Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for West Africa and head of the UN Office for West Africa, known as UNOWAS. Before that, you oversaw the hybrid African Union-United Nations operation in Darfur, and you were also the joint chief mediator of the Darfur peace process, the Darfur peace negotiations in 2013-14. So let me ask you this. There are many worrying signs of democratic erosion in Africa, especially West Africa, with reports of electoral irregularities, internet disruptions, the arrest of pro-democracy activists and journalists, the killing of peaceful protesters in demonstrations, and as I mentioned earlier, the return of coups d'etat, which we thought were a relic of the past. How do you explain this trend?
Well, a number of factors explain what have been characterized as erosion of democracy, democratic decline in West Africa. And among them is a failure on the part of some leaders to respect, first and foremost, their own national constitutions. But of course, the background to that being that after several years of military rule in West Africa, there was a wave of democratization. And out of that, you had ECOWAS instruments such as the mechanism for conflict prevention and additional protocol in good governance. And these laid out clear parameters or standards for measuring democratic governance. We have seen in a number of countries that there has been a failure to respect these norms. A clear example, of course, being the case of Guinea, where in spite of the best advice and efforts, the president at the time, President Alpha Conde, proceeded to amend the constitution to elongate his stay leading to the reaction from civil society and ultimately the military, which resulted in a coup d'etat. In other instances, we have seen that failure to ensure that there are credible, peaceful, transparent elections have also triggered conflict. Most people forget that in Mali, it was flawed parliamentary elections, which triggered the intervention of the military after, of course, there was more or less a civilian insurrection. The rules are very clear that in order to have acceptable elections, every effort must be made in the pre-election period, in the day elections, and post-election to have inclusive processes. Electoral commissions that will be independent and people who can ensure that the rules are clear and the level playing field is created for elections. Constitutional courts with persons of integrity who will uphold the rule of law. When these are compromised, as indeed we saw in the case of Mali, unfortunately, it led to the coup d'etat, which, of course, also got complicated by a very complex security challenge already existing in the country. So most experts will tell you that there has been instrumentalization of judiciary, there has been literary amendment of constitutions, there has been a shrinking of the democratic space where opposition have not been given the space to engage in dialogue and inclusive processes, which would have helped in consolidating and entrenching democratic governance in West Africa. So these are contributory factors. Of course, we have to also add the fact that most young people have said and alleged that they have not seen the democratic dividends. So democracy should be more than just about having elections, insisting on separation of power, etc. That's all well and good. But at the end of the day, the population also want to see improvements in their livelihood. And the failure to deliver on socioeconomic needs, consequently leading to a lot of frustration, these have also contributed to the erosion of democracy, which has been witnessed in certain countries. I do not want to give the impression that it has all been gloom and doom. In fact, we have seen that on other fronts, some countries continue to make good progress, particularly in preparing for elections and ensuring that more and more civil society, women and youth groups play an active role in monitoring electoral processes before those elections, on election day, and play a role also in peace building after elections. So there are those positive trends also in a number of countries. But I think by and large, the concern about return of the military is a legitimate one, and it ought to be taken quite seriously so that we can see what needs to be done to prevent this from taking us back to a period where there was a proliferation of military regimes across West Africa and Africa.
I will get to how young people are feeling skeptical about elections, and they're not seeing the democratic dividends in a moment, and also that there are examples of resilience of the democratic process in Ghana, for example, your country, and Kofi Annan's country, in Botswana and Cape Verde, and the recent elections in Kenya. I'll get to that in a moment. But the decline of democracy has coincided with an increase in armed violence, in conflict, whether in West Africa, where jihadist violence racks the Sahel, or in Ethiopia, where the government and Tigrayan forces have fought a bitter war. Kofi Annan saw a clear link between democracy, or lack of democracy, and conflict. Let's listen to what he said a few years ago.
Too many regimes fail to represent the needs and hopes of their people. Conflict is often caused by having unequal access to political power. It follows that a good way to avoid conflict is to encourage inclusive democracy, which gives everyone a say in decisions that affect their lives.
So let me ask you this, Mohammed. Do you worry that a return to military or autocratic governments could increase instability and the risk of war in Africa?
The reason is obvious. The military lack legitimacy in the sense that they were not elected to govern the population. And Afrobarometer polls across the continent, in particular in West Africa, shows that overwhelming majority, almost 84%, their preference for elections as a means of selecting leaders. So when leaders come through the barrel of the gun, they tend to use repressive means, by definition are not inclusive. Group of military leaders who usurp not just the executives, but the legislative functions in a state. In fact, sometimes the judicial functions of the state. And institutions are therefore weakened. They're not allowed to grow and to become strong, to play their respective roles. Media is often stifled. In today's world, when you have a young population that have enjoyed freedoms and liberties, entrench a military government requires repression against this youthful population. And that's where inevitably it will lead to street battles. There will be resistance by the population. The nature of military regimes are such that they tend also to scare away both domestic and foreign investors. People see military intervene in a country and they associate that with instability, deepening crisis. And therefore, this negative impact on the economic, social side can deepen. It will tend to deepen socioeconomic crisis in the country, which will also fuel more instability, more crisis.
Yeah. That's a very important point, actually, that military regimes scare away potential investment, whether it's foreign or local or regional, and therefore has an economic aspect, an economic impact, and it's a vicious circle. There will be a dissatisfied electorate, and there will be a dictatorship, military, more often than not. And as you say, 84% of the electorate prefer elections, but they want to see these democratic dividends. Figures published by Afrobarometer show that large majorities of people surveyed in Africa express a preference for democracy, as you said, over any other form of government. They also show, however, that young people, as you mentioned earlier, are more skeptical than their elders that the ballot box can deliver the change they want. They abstain more often. Africa is the youngest continent, yet several heads of state have served for decades, and others are tempted to ignore constitutional limits. Kofi Annan warned us against extended presidential terms, sowing despair and anger. Let's listen to what he said.
When governments and leaders believe that they are God sent to protect their people, to run a country, they want to stay there forever. And in the process, ignore the rights of the population, lock them up, mistreat them. It's against human nature. They will react.
So my question to you, Mohammed, is this: how can we ensure youth participation and a greater role for women in politics in Africa? And do you think term limits enhance inclusion?
First of all, on term limits, I think that at this particular point in the evolution, in the development of democracy on the continent, term limits are more helpful because of the fact that they will help us to deal with monopoly of power, family rule, dynastic tendencies that we have seen in some countries. And unfortunately, when these sit-tight, long-serving rulers have led the scene by one way or the other, they tend to plunge their countries into crisis because there have been no clear systems of succession and continuity of governance. So term limits will be helpful in that regard. And for West Africa, again, the tendency has been for a preference among the population for term limits. We are largely pluralistic societies. And one way to ensure each component part of the polity has an opportunity to exercise leadership is to implement term limits so that power can shift or rotate north, south, east, west, between religious groups, between different ethnic groups. And that will help in building national cohesion than to have one particular family or ethnic group monopolize power over an extended period. Term limits also injects new ideas, brings new leaders with new ideas. And quite frankly, after 10, 15 years, if one hasn't been able to change this situation, one wonders what new ideas can be brought to the fore. And so with a youthful population such as we have in Africa, it doesn't speak well when older people are holding on and not allowing a generation succession to come on board with a new approach to doing things, new methodologies, new skills to bring a dynamism to our countries. So I think these are important issues to be considered, alongside also opening up the political systems to more women for the simple reason that they are a majority in the society. African countries, or any society for that matter, will shortchange themselves if they continue to lock out women and don't allow sufficient, significant numbers of women to participate, especially in leadership roles, political level, at state level, across board. Indeed, also even in private sector. We've seen that African women have been very dynamic, and in the informal trading sector, been highly successful. It only indicates that if they were to be given more resources, and admitted into the formal sector, they will do equally well because they have proven their business acumen. Once again, I mean, the majority of African population is youthful, so not allowing sufficient number of young people on board to come and play leadership roles is also denying us of the tremendous energy and new technologies that these youth have acquired, and which can help to accelerate, in fact, to frog leap development in many areas. How to achieve that? I believe firmly in affirmative action. We'll need gender parity laws to be adopted to insist on certain number of women in our national assemblies, in judiciary, in government establishments, in private sector, as I said. We need laws that also will open up to young people. I'm here this week in Nigeria, and Nigeria adopted a law which was called, its title, Not Too Young to Run, and by which they lowered the age threshold for offices, including president, Senate, House of Rep, etc. That's a step in the right direction. But beyond that, beyond the laws, we also need to ensure that obstacles are not put in the place of, in the way of young people by way of filing fees and other monetary requirements, which obviously women and young people do not have. So these are some of the issues that need to be taken on board in order to include women in youth in governance on the continent, something that Kofi Annan was very passionate and always advocated.
Kofi Annan used to say, "You're never too young to lead, and you're never too old to learn." I don't want to end on a gloomy note, Mohamed. So, as I said earlier, we see the resilience of democratic processes and values in many African countries. The recent elections in Kenya, for example, were overwhelmingly peaceful, and the opposition candidate won the presidency. And it was a result that was accepted. Ghana, your country and Kofi's country, Botswana, Cape Verde, are often cited as beacons of democracy and good governance. So my question is this: what can be learned from these countries, and how can good practices be shared across the continent and beyond?
There are situations that should make us hope. We've cited Kenya. One can refer to Malawi, where the Supreme Court overturned elections and caused a rerun, which the ruling government lost. That was very impressive. We can refer to a number of West African countries where ruling governments have conducted elections and lost them to opposition and allowed power to rotate, such as in Nigeria, where what President Jonathan said at the time in 2015, that a single drop of any Nigerian is not worth his ambition to be president. These are all very encouraging signs. As you mentioned, in my own Ghana, where not once but 2 times ruling governments have lost election to opposition and allowed for peaceful transfer of power. There are positive lessons that need to be learned. Additionally, I think the role of civil society, and we've seen West African civil society beginning to organize in a sub-regional context through a network, West Africa network for solidarity to defend democratic transitions. So this reaction from civil society is highly encouraging, and one that gives me hope that all is not lost by any means, that what we are seeing is just a passing dark cloud, and that the forces of democracy are much more entrenched. The desire and the will in the population to ensure that people choose their leaders, that their leaders are not persons who will impose themselves on them. This is a very strong trend in West Africa and indeed other parts of Africa that I don't believe this reversal will not be a permanent, irreversible process.
Mohamed Ibn Chambas, I would like to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us and helping us understand why Kofi Annan tried so hard to advance democracy worldwide, including on the continent of his birth. Thank you for being on Kofi Time.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
You've been listening to Kofi Time. Wherever you are, please share the values that Kofi Annan represented that you think are relevant today using hashtag Kofi Time. Kofi Time is brought to you by the Kofi Annan Foundation and the United Nations Information Service in Geneva. Produced by Gianluca Alaria. Join me again for the next episode of Kofi Time.